It looks like we've got a bit of after-lunch attrition or slow people coming in, or people slowly coming in. Probably not slow people coming in, that's probably wrong. I think the slow person's already here. This session, we are going to be talking about a couple of things, but I just want to get the panelists up here, if you can join me. And then just also say that a couple of housekeeping things. That tomorrow, the session that we were going to have on the, what's it called again? Preparation of the UN comment on drug policy and the effect of drug policy on economic and social development. That is not going to take place tomorrow because it's quite an important thing, so we're going to actually feature it in the closing plenary, talking about what messages can we take out of here to inform the United Nations comment. But it's all quite a mystery, these comments, and that nobody's quite sure how they come about or what they mean or how influential they are, but we'll discuss that a little bit on Friday. But I think it's a good idea to try and get something out of this that is concrete to carry forward. So in place of that, we will be having a meeting with the local drug action committees and the people that were in Monday's meeting with UNODC, so we can continue with those discussions. But there's a fantastic SANPUD and input joint session in the morning, which is also very good. So I just wanted to do that little bit of housekeeping. Jason, you're going to stay there or here?
I just didn't want to interrupt your speech.
Oh, I'm used to being interrupted. Yes, Michelle. In the board meetings, I'm used to being interrupted. Okay. So I must confess that my eyesight has got really bad, and the text on this is really small. So excuse me while I put these glasses on and try and read it. Right. I don't see Colleen here, but I wanted to thank Colleen for doing a very nice segue into, oh, there you are, into the session, which was planned, no doubt, and so thank you for that. So we're going to be talking about, in the session, be careful what you wish for is the title. Because often there's a very simplistic view that all we need to do is introduce better health systems to treat people, and we need to legally regulate drugs. Now, we've seen what happens with legal regulation in sometimes with alcohol, with nicotine in the past, with a lot of other products that are legally regulated, which somehow seems to think that let people think that they're safe now, when really there's an uber-capitalistic agenda behind it, perhaps. We've got to be careful of these things, and I don't want to take away from what the speakers are going to say, but these are some of the things we're going to talk about, as well as that relationship between the criminalizing of drug use and the criminalizing of sex work, which in South Africa, in the court position, there was a strong argument that drug use was one of the reasons why sex work should remain criminalized at one stage, which is a kind of weird argument, but anyway. So without further ado, I'm not going to take any time now. I'm just going to go straight into the speakers. And this is where I need the glasses and to try and work out what my notes say. So the first speaker we've got today is Simon Howell, Dr. Simon Howell. So Simon is going to bring quite an interesting perspective, because Simon was one of the people that wrote the court's position for the judgment in Cape Town, in the Western Cape High Court, which then went on to inform some of the other things, and it's quite an interesting approach that they took. So Simon is a senior researcher at the Cape Town, the Center for Criminology up at UCT, and I've known Simon for several years. He's got a PhD in philosophy. He's written some really interesting papers, right from the philosophy of drugs to, we've written a couple of papers together on the National Drug Master Plan and on the perpetuation of apartheid through drug policy, which are made more brilliant by Simon's input. I'm very grateful for him to be here today, and I believe his cannabis session was really interesting this morning as well. So, Simon, I'm not going to go through your whole blurb because I think your reputation speaks for itself, but over to you to start off. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can I have my slides? Because I may not know what to say without the slides. So, when Sean asked me to do this paper, it caused me somewhat of an existential crisis, because for the one part, when we wrote this, I was really busy, and we all put our bits in, and we submitted it to the courts, and it came back, and John Davies, the judge, thanked us for it and said it had been quite influential in his decision-making process. But after that, I kind of forgot about it, to be honest. And it's only when I was looking it up now that I realized that it actually had some impact, surprisingly. I just didn't know this. And it also caused me an existential crisis in the sense that I looked at it and I was like, but I used to write neatly then. What happened? Because why is everything so messy now? But I think messiness is part of the theme of here. I've called this presentation Cannabis Contrails. And contrails are, when a plane flies overhead, those like little wisps of cloud that it leaves in the sky? Those are contrails. Now, contrails are a useful metaphor, I think, because on the one hand, they show that no matter how loud and thunderous we roar across the sky, we've got to ask ourselves, what have we left behind? Has that changed anything? But also, I think it's a useful metaphor because contrails only form or appear in the right environment. In other words, no matter how loud you are or how much noise you make, if it's not the right environment, you won't leave anything behind. So for that reason, I thought contrails sounded like and it's something new. No one, I don't think, has used contrails before in cannabis, and it's got its alliteration. So as presentations go. So if I can have the next slide, please. So, we wrote this paper, colleagues and I, which was submitted to Judge Davies, which looked at essentially, the title was Balancing the Harms of Cannabis in South Africa, and it essentially made an argument as best we could at the time, which was quite a number of years ago, for the decriminalization of cannabis in some way. At that point in time, there was still up for grabs as to what that would look like. And we didn't really know what it would look like either, to be honest, but we thought, we ought to make an argument, and we put together what evidence we had, and we submitted it. Looking back, however, I think, we were right in some parts and we were wrong in some parts, and we didn't go for enough in another part. But I've sort of taken out the main themes from that paper, because it's very difficult to find online as well. We'll put it on the criminology website. I couldn't find it for few hours, for instance. So, we'll put it online if you want to read it. But there's always been, the key point about we were that the harms caused by cannabis are less than the harms of prohibition of cannabis. And moreover, you could even go further and to say that prohibition has created the very environment in which the harms occur in the first place. So that argument is sound, I think. But there is always this potential for understanding or what legislating based on harms, because there's always the concern that even though you don't intend it, the unintended consequence is that you end up creating more harm than good, whether it be for cannabis or whether it be for any other drug, or whether it be for anything else for that matter. And I think that is something that we've experienced, or at least seen hints of in South Africa with the current legislation, is that it's created such a murky context, it's created such a blurred policing context especially, that inadvertently, despite our best efforts, things haven't gone the way we wanted them to. So I think there is the recognition, at least, that there has been some failure here. And that's important because if we give up now, then there's no point to this. You need to keep looking for solutions, or at least to keep revising what has been done. And I think there needs to be an element of self-criticality or self-reflection in cannabis policy that is often not there. And I speak for myself as well here. Is that asking the hard questions to ourselves is often more important than asking the hard questions to other people. And of course, there is no objective platform from which to speak here. This is a platform, but it's not objective one in that sense. And there may be better or worse ways of doing things statistically or economically or socially, but there's no, I mean, we tend to, when we are discussing these things, get put into camps or groups, and we believe we have some sort of moral basis on which to talk and which to speak and which to overspeak other people, but in fact, I don't think there is actually a moral platform. There are better ways of doing things and worse ways of doing things, depending on how you define harm. If harm is death and harm is injury, then sure, there are better ways of doing things. But that's just one way of understanding it. I think unless we're self-reflexive and self-critical of our own involvement in policy making, we may have problems. Can I have the next slide, please? Oh, sorry. Aha. The biggest issue and the biggest failure of our paper and a lot of work we've done is that while we've moved legislation from sort of black and white, the Drugs Trafficking Act, in which there was drugs and there were no drugs, and people, it was very clear cut, we've entered into this vast expanse of grey, which pragmatically has created issues, especially in terms of policing. How do you police that which is sort of undefined in terms of the law? How do the police go in and engage with this type of thing? And unfortunately, as I'll speak to in a minute, policing is the primary and almost always sole response of this government to any issue, whether it be drugs, whether it be sex work, whether it be poverty. So unless we devise mechanisms to direct or guide the police, ultimately it's wishful thinking to ask for anything else. And that brings me to the second point, which is that the devil is always and always will be in the detail. It's easy to come up with ideas often, or it's at least easy to talk about the ideas, but how do you implement them in a way that is pragmatic and that is step by step, foot by foot, over time? In other words, in cannabis's terms, do we count, for instance, plants, or do we weigh them, or do we invoke principles of morality, or do we just ignore everything? How do we implement these things? And I think that's often in South Africa where we get stuck. Even the Constitution, it's got great ideas in it. How do you implement it? It's all well and good to say, you have the right freedom to do whatever, but unless you have economic potential, you can't really engage with that type of system. So in the same way, I think cannabis is kind of stuck, or cannabis debates in this country. Speaking to policing, I think it's important to acknowledge that, in South Africa, we tend to use the police for most things. That's a function of both capacity, in the sense that the police have more capacity than anyone else in comparison to other government departments, but also because of the way in which the South African zeitgeist is formulated, in which we tend to send the police to deal with things. Think about the gangs. The gangs would be a great example of sending in social development, health, and a whole lot of other education. But no, let's send in the police, and let's repeatedly send in the police, even despite the fact that it continues to fail. Same thing with drugs. So despite the fact that we have never had any success, we'll keep doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. I think it was Einstein who said that's a definition of insanity or something. But the police are just not the right tool for the job. That doesn't mean they don't have a role to play, but they're not the right tool for the job. Until we identify and capacitate the right tool for the job, we can't expect any different result. And we must also understand that the work of policing, often we scapegoat the police and the like, and having worked with them for a very long time now, I can say the work of policing is fundamentally structured by targets. Unless you change those targets, the police are not going to act any different. And that's not because they are somehow different from society, but because we all act in that way. If we have a job and we have targets, we have to meet those in order to remain employed. We can't expect anything else. So until you change fundamentally the structure and the focus and the target of policing, we can't expect them to do anything else. That, of course, doesn't excuse all the corruption and the targeting of drug users and stuff. I'm talking formally, but it does give us a hint at why we need to figure out a better way of doing things. And unfortunately, in the paper we discussed, I don't think we engaged with that enough. And I think, with the privacy bill and the cannabis debate as it stands now, the police have been often positioned as antagonists, as something that ought to be out of it. But unless we include the police in this, we're never going to get anywhere, because they're fundamentally the people who are going to do the government's job, or the governance of cannabis. Irrespective of whether we like it or not, for the foreseeable future, they will be the principal means by which governance is applied in this instance. So finally, talking about politics. Drugs remain drugs because they are illegal, and I think that's quite widely accepted. However, simply saying that legalization ought to be then the strategy, or that regulation is the strategy, presupposes a functional state, presupposes a state that can regulate these things in a manner that is effective or decreases the harm and the like. I don't know if South Africa has the capacity currently to do that, frankly. It's a hard question to answer, well, hard question to something that, not nice to say, but ultimately, if we look at case studies from other parts of South Africa's forms of regulation, it does not have the capacity to deal with this. So introducing something as complex as drugs, which has the capacity or the potential to go awry very quickly, is very dangerous. I'm not sure what the answer is then. I'm nearly done. The other point is that, in terms of policy discussions, unless they have some sort of pragmatic realization, it's pretty much just conversation. And I think it's something that I've been guilty of, and I think, papers I've written have been guilty of, is that unless we do something about this issue, pragmatically, realize some change on the ground, we're talking. And it's policy, and it's a policy discussion. And frankly, a lot of money gets spent on policy discussions, but the money could be used elsewhere. And I think we need to justify our time and our expense in terms of the broader picture. Is how do we effectively use the money that we are given or donated or funded to engage with the public in a manner that is actually useful and it actually produces change on the ground. So contrails, in other words. How do we maximize those? Finally, Jacques Derrida mentioned once that there are no drugs in nature. His argument was that the concept of a drug isn't necessarily political, that it's not in and of itself anything. We make the concept of a drug. We create the concept as a normative, moral, laden term that we utilize both to condemn people and to advantage people. And until we recognize that there's no neutrality here and there's no objectivity, we're automatically going to have a lot of presuppositions every time we have a conversation. There needs to be an acknowledgement that you can't use the word drug without invoking a whole range of social, psychometric, psychological meanings that come with it. When you call someone a drug user, you're not identifying that person in an objective, empirical way as a person who uses an illegal or banned substance. You're identifying that person in a normative way. You're saying you are something. And we need to recognize that. Because inadvertently, if we just have a response that says, well, you're not a drug user, we're not policing you now, we're using harm reduction, well, that still is normatively laden. No matter how empirical we may make it sound, it still has a normative dimension to it, and it still has is ultimately the basis for judgment. So, the concept of harm reduction, I think, has gone slightly awry as a result of us not acknowledging that normative dimension. Once upon a time, harm reduction was the in thing, Now, it's sometimes being questioned, and I think that's because we're finally acknowledging that there's more to it than this, that you can't just simply medicalize things, because medicalization leads to pathologization, which is exactly where we started when we started with the harm reduction thing in the first place. So, sort of to end off in my brief speech, I think there's a benefit here of hindsight, which I'm utilizing, which of course you can only get in hindsight. And I think, to sort of leave you with this idea that I don't think we have the answers to the questions right now that we are looking for. But we need to start by acknowledging how very difficult these questions are in the first place. Because at the moment, often we try and make things a little bit simpler so as we can produce some type of response or policy paper or whatever. But in the process, we lose a lot of the meaning and the dynamics that are involved. So yeah, it's been a tough day of reflection, but this is where we're at least in my mind. Thank you.